Welcome back to MythVision Podcast. I'm your host, Derek Lambert, and I'm joined by none other than the legend himself, Dr. Markus Vinzent. Welcome back to MythVision, my friend.
Yeah, thanks very much, Derek, for inviting me back to your channel.
Thank you. You have several publications, and you're constantly writing books. Let's get a few of these on the screen here. So, several books you have, popular books that you've written. Can you tell us a little bit about your publications for the viewer who might just now be going, who is this guy? You seem to know him, but I don't know him. What is your interest? What are you a specialist on? And specifically, what are you writing about often?
Good question. You will see I've got a bit of a range of interests and therefore also books and publications. Just hold on with these ones here. Yeah, no, a bit further down.
Okay.
Yeah, these ones. Yeah. So you see the latest output, some of the output, I have to say, from the last 12 months publications. So you can see 3 volumes, the red ones. Those are the reconstruction of the 10-letter collection of Paul, the Greek 10 letters of Paul. And that's the first edition of what we usually call the Marcionite collection of Pauline letters. 1 volume is the introduction, 2 volumes are the Greek reconstruction with all the evidences and commentary and so forth.
Wow.
On the left side, it's about 2,500 pages, so you can indulge into some stuff. Hence, when we talk about the 10-letter collection of Paul, it has been some work for some years to reconstruct the work, and I'm grateful to the people who are inside the book rather than outside on the cover, and that's my team. Kevin Lance Larthorpe and Mark Bilby and Jake Bull, and they will be on the front cover of the upcoming English translation of these 3 volumes. I think they will come out next year or the year after. Left is Early Christianity and the Challenge of Writing History, and that's really being published just a few days ago with Cambridge University Press. It is a follow-up of my earlier book from 2019 on historiography. So how to write history? How do we approach history? And in 2019, I suggested that we move backwards from history because we are writing history today with our problems and questions in our minds. And then I was prompted that I should go further. And so I reflected more upon that kind of methodology and discovered that I have to bring in more of myself. And so this is a book on autofictionality, on the historian themselves and the challenge of writing history, which I suggest is not the evidence, it's ourselves. We are the biggest challenge and the biggest problem when we write history. And if you scroll a bit further down, you can see these are 2 volumes on the left side, because when I retired, I picked up an earlier concern, which was writing novels. So the fictionality is also an auto-fictional novel in 2 volumes, to which, as I can show you, I can add another volume of a novel which has appeared, just this week. Shadow of Proximity. And so that's the kind of pastime I'm doing, which is quite nice. On the right side, you see the concordance, and that was the preliminary work on the basis of which and in parallel, did my reconstruction work that appeared 2 years ago. And it gives us a full comparison between the 10-letter collection and its vocabulary and the canonical collection of the New Testament and its vocabulary. So that's really one of the baselines.
That's a lot of work.
And then I edited a volume on biblical figures of female in late antiquity, because I'm also a specialist on the 4th century, 5th centuries, up to the 14th century, because when you go a bit further down, you will see the volumes on Meister Eckhart, on which I'm also one of the specialists. And I've published and translated all of Eckhart's vernacular homilies, 2 volumes, and written about him. And that's the other concern which I have, which is a major thinker of the 14th century. And if you go a bit further down, we see the Fathers of the Church. That's, together with Kelly McCarthy Spurl, a translation, the first translation ever into modern language of Eusebius of Caesarea, one of the big guys in church history. And he wrote towards the end of his life 5 books, 2 books against Marcellus of Encyra and 2 books about church theology. And here we provide a long introduction. So what happened to Eusebius after the Council of Nicaea, and why did he engage in these 5 works, all written against Marcellus of Encyra, one of the proponents and the supporters of the Nicene Council, our first ecumenical council. So you can see that's a bit of the spread of work I have done and do. And we have mentioned the Gray book here, because that was my first book on Marcion and the dating of the Synoptic Gospels, a book which I published in 2011-12, and which really threw up the question of the dating of the Synoptic Gospels. And I think that's something which we are going to discuss more today.
Yes.
See a bit of a range of what I'm doing. So I have a lot of time, and I love writing, and that's,
Yeah, and thank you for going through that. Some of those publications are more recent from the last time we've interviewed. I don't recall seeing some of those, so those are newer. Yeah, you're right. Today's episode specifically, I reached out to Jack Bull and I said, "Hey, Jack, I'm wanting to do a video. Obviously, I want to get the facts right and be with the latest, greatest of what Marcion scholarship, those who are more acquainted with Marcion and have the alternative view from what the consensus has been in the past, and that is the idea that Marcion redacted a gospel we call Luke, or someone in Marcion school or in the vein or whatever, they would say redacted it. I think they accuse Marcion of it. And the scholars such as yourself say, sorry, the opposite is what happened. They actually added to Marcion's text. And so it's much messier than that, much more nuanced, much more complicated. But I asked the question because I was getting ready for not only wanting to make this video, but I was preparing for a debate I was doing on dating Luke Acts. And I took, I think, a fairly conservative view, even though I know it's not the consensus yet. I took the conservative view that 95 AD, and I mean, I'm literally pushing it. That's supposing, right, in my mind during this debate with a guy, I was like, look, I want to just go with the Josephus evidence for this debate because we can get all over the place. And I want to show you that he had to have been using Josephus. So I used the 7 arguments that Steve Mason brings up from Quirinius, Lysanias, even the 3 schools, specifically with the Pharisees argument, the Theudas Judas stuff, even Agrippa the First death. These things. I didn't even get into all of them in the debate. That's how bad it is in a debate setting to try and do this. So I was just saying, okay, grant that Josephus wrote this in 93, published in 93, 94. Like bare minimum, give him a year, which I imagine a decade's more likely, but like a year at least. And I'm just trying to come with a bare minimum of 95. I just figure early 2nd century. However, there are scholars such as yourself and others who say, Derek, that's very conservative. In fact, you really need to bump those numbers up. So I wanted to have you join me on evidences, plural, like different kinds of evidence that you would say help us to date Acts later than what even some of the scholars you think early 2nd century. And you just say, well, have they considered some of these things? And one of those is the debate over Marcion, because I think Joseph B. Tyson, and I'll shut up and I want to hear your thoughts on this. Joseph B. Tyson has he's trying to be careful that like Luke's earlier and that Acts is a reaction after the fact of Marcion or something. Take us into the debate. I know you know it. And help us understand, Dr. Vinzent.
Happy to do that. before we start, let's set the tone, because I watched your intro, and there's a new intro which I haven't seen before, so it's a bit less fancy and a bit more historical, right?
Yes.
And that reminded me of my still unpublished, so I still have some unpublished material, but my unpublished inaugural lecture, which I have given to Birmingham University when I joined Birmingham University in 1999 as head of department. And although I had given it only a year later, I thought I set the tone for this department, which was when I joined the department, an entirely Christian department. 11 members of staff, all white, all Christians, different denominations, but still all Christians, in the midst of a city which is in the UK and has been in the UK, the first so-called secular and non-British, non-white British majority city. So a huge variation of traditions, cultures, religions. And here we have got a secular university even, which was created in 1899 by the citizens of Birmingham, paid from their own pocket, where they prevented the university at the time when they started the university to have two faculties. And the one which they didn't want to have on campus was politics. And the second, which they excluded from the normal range of faculties which you normally have, was theology and religious studies. Why that? They said, we don't want to have conflicts and debates on campus. No ideologies, just pure math, physics, also anthropology, yeah, art history, fine, but no party politics, so no religion. Interestingly, in 1940, just after the war had started, they introduced politics, the department, and they started with H.G. Wood as the first professor for religious studies. What was the change of mind? Because they recognized if you do not critical studies of politics and not critical studies of theology and Christian studies and religious studies, you end up with wars, with people going to war and not reflecting about the morality of war, not reflecting about why these wars take place. And most of the wars takes place between different religions or different religious cultures. So that was one thing which I thought about. But then the topic of my inaugural lecture, which I've chosen at the time, was something that haunted me when I saw your intro. Most of the religious sites that you have shown are sites of dead religions with no adherents today. The Aztecs, the Egyptians, the Greeks, the Romans. And so that is straight to the topic which I was talking about in Birmingham 20, 30 years ago. It was about the lifespan of religions. And my theory and thesis was every religion has a lifespan. It comes, it's being transformed, and it goes. And the question which I was raising at the lecture was, what's the lifespan of Christianity? And what's the lifespan of Judaism? And what's the lifetime of Islam? If all religions, as far as historians know, have a lifespan, it's also got a death. And what is going to create the death of these religions? I'm not saying that religions per se are going to disappear. Apparently, as soon as religions are there, new religions spring off. So the nature of religion seems to be that it doesn't disappear, but it creates new forms of religion, which sometimes pretty quickly, like with the Roman religion, and pretty quickly like with the Egyptian religion and the Aztecs, for different reasons, political, cultural, language reasons. A religion comes and suddenly disappears and makes place for new forms of religion. So the question for me really is, what is the ingredients of these changes? What keeps a religion staying, and what makes it going?
That's a great question.
Yeah, it's a great question. Yeah, that's the question you raised with your intro.
Yeah.
And I think this also is the question of myth vision. So what is the vision for new myths to appear and older myths to disappear or to be transformed? I have no firm answer. I didn't have one 30 years ago, and I certainly have less than an answer today. But what is clear, looking at your kids, maybe you're looking at your kids, I don't know them, but looking at my kids, it becomes quite clear that forms of religion which are no longer engaging with their own tradition critically and are even not aware of what they are and what they believe and how that has come about, is the beginning of the end. I would say it's almost part of a transformation which is so far that the origin of that religion is already disappearing in the form of religion that still exists. And this is a major concern for me, because what I'm seeing today, let's say as Muslims, what Muslims believe, or what Christians believe, what Jews believe, is so different, is so incomparable in many ways with what we experience when we look 2,000 years back, that people cannot believe it.
Yeah. Even you're saying the mode of Christianity is not the same Christianity that was often even practiced 2,000 years back.
Precisely.
And that change happens. What I find interesting, even when we get to our subject matter today, is the religion, whatever that black hole might have looked like in the first century, the black box, if you will, like what really was going on the ground with the movement that followed this character we would call Jesus. Even from there to the time they're writing, Luke's writing, Marcion's writing, Acts, it's already transformed so much between that to that time. I mean, it's pretty wild to see how quickly religions evolve and adapt, mutate to adjust to their new environments and to also compete with other ones. So there's so many things. Real quick, we got a super chat already. Pagan Prince, thank you so much, said, we should introduce agoras back into universities. It's meant to discuss critical thought and open discussion. Be like Socrates again.
Oh, I fully agree. I mean, look, that's not a question. That's a very serious suggestion. And I would agree with that. I mean, even the distinction between, on the one side, philosophy and on the other side, theology or religious studies, it's been an introduction which goes back to Immanuel Kant, who was a pious man. He comes from Herrenhut, from the Pietists. And he, as a philosopher, tried to establish what you claim should be brought back. He tried to establish the separation between the two. So no discourse, no critical thought in theology and religious studies, because those are believers. Things you can't discuss, you can't understand. Because you cannot understand it, you have to believe it. And on the other side was logic, was moral and legal reasoning, which was kept apart. And the question of the divine was taken away from philosophy and put into the basket of religious studies. In my eyes, it was the death of the deities, of the divines, and it was the death of philosophy on the other side.
Yeah, I don't know. This is my opinion. I really love learning about the old religion, the old time religion, polytheistic deities roaming around. All of that stuff gives me kind of nostalgia, which is why I made the intro. We're all about seeing the patterns and connections and just the human fingerprints in all of the religions. And I think there's something beautiful about that. And I used to be like, oh, it's not true. Now, don't get me wrong. I don't believe that it's literally true, but I do think that I find value in fiction. I find value in symbolism, in allegory, in stories that don't have to be literal. I find value in this stuff. And I wish we could get back to some of that stuff. It's just to me, it's unfortunate. Anyway, Solera Knight sent another super chat. Evangelicon plagiarized by whom? Tertullian's view? I don't know.
Well, I mean, Tertullian is quite clear. And he more or less repeats what he has read in Irenaeus, that the Euangelikon, and for those who are not introduced, the Euangelikon is the title that Marcion gives to his gospel, which then becomes later part of what he calls the New Testament. So his collection of the Euangelion, the gospel, and his collection of the 10 Pauline letters that he calls apostles, simply the apostle. So he has two simple names for the entities that are part of his New Testament gospel. So we would translate it today: gospel and apostle. Those are what makes for him the New Testament, and which he introduced by his own preface.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Solera. So I'm going to get to you in just a second here, Bakken, but I want to allow the Marcion discussion to enter into the scene, because if there's anyone I know of online that is an academic, that's public facing, that really popularizes this idea of Marcion in the field of the debate of whether or not who came first, who wrote what, when. As far as Luke Acts is concerned, can you do us a solid by painting a portrait that we can track of the chronology and how you imagine this happened, and when you might place the date of Acts? Then we'll just get to Q&A, because honestly, I'm a student, okay? And I don't try to pretend I know things that I don't know, or try to act like I have this facade of awareness, and I don't know enough about this, Dr. Vinzent. So I hope that others will join me in the philosophy of being a student and learning from you and understanding your view. And then, let's see where it goes.
Yeah, thanks. But also, let me also say to you and to all the listeners, I'm a fellow student. I'm not somebody who is hierarchically beyond anybody here in this room, online or on screens. So you're not only supposed to ask questions, you also can make judgments and you can make suggestions. I'm taking every suggestion very serious, as long as I can think about it and understand it. And so I'm reflecting with you and not talking to you. Now that I'm asked to outline just my view, it's, first of all, it's pretty simple. I came along, just like Derek and many of the listeners, I came along from the same school. I was trained in the same tradition. And even when I published the first volume, that then proliferated in further volumes, where I thought about the question of the dating of the Gospels, and then even further dating of Acts and of the Pauline letters, which was the latest work I did. I started the whole business until 2009 and 10, believing in what you believe and believing what all my colleagues believe. And that's why I'm not surprised that people are not easy to move away from their beliefs, right? I mean, it took me 30 years to convince myself that I might be trapped and I might have to take a different view. I tell you, when I sent the manuscript on this book on the resurrection, on which we also touched upon, and when I sent that manuscript off to the publisher, at the time it was Ashgate, now it's with Routledge, it had a different title. It simply said Christ's Resurrection, Early Christianity. But I couldn't sleep. I could not sleep because I could not answer one question, and that was the impact Paul has, and the little impact he had on so many writings in early Christianity, which I couldn't figure out. He's so present in Acts, I mean, he's the protagonist in Acts. From chapter 8, 9 onwards to the end of Acts, it is a book about Paul. And let's take the traditional view, that this book was written in the 70s, 80s. And take also the traditional view that this book was written by the same author who wrote Luke. And if we take the view that the other Gospels, Matthew, Mark, were published around the same time, Mark probably even the source for Luke, and with the additional source Q. So if a Pauline student like Luke, who writes almost half his life on Paul, and has some reflections of Paul in Luke, although people are skeptical about that, because they say, well, there's more Paul in Mark than there is in Luke, which causes a first problem, right? So how can it be that the chap who writes half a book or more than half a book on Paul has less in his gospel of Paul than the chap on whom he has copied Mark?
Right.
Okay, well, we all don't know answers, right? So we just brush it aside and say, no, it's not. It's Luke is Luke, and Luke is the same author as Acts, right? But here we have got a first hurdle. But the same hurdle then accrues more heavily when you see that the first book that we know of outside the canon, The Shepherd of Hermas, is written in Rome. 60 chapters. Not a single trace of Paul in that book. So if Paul had already been as prominent that we have a gospel writer who writes a protagonist's novel or a historical book on Paul, but then Paul has no influence in The Shepherd of Hermas, in a book which gives us an outline of a Roman community, well established. He has a patron, a female patron, so he is well conversing with the presbyters in Rome. So he lives in Rome, has no clue of Paul. What a strange idea. Next strangity is we have our first catechism, the Didache. People suppose that this text was written in the 1st century, maybe in Syriac. Well, wouldn't you think that if the Gospels have been written in the 1st century, and Paul is so known to at least one Gospel writer, maybe two Gospel writers at least, yeah, so Mark and Luke, that a catechism that introduces people into the Christian community, that knows baptism, that knows the Lord's Prayer, that has a chapter on who Christ was, and knows the Sunday celebrations, the Eucharist, knows all what we have to do in ethics and morality, knows the apostles, the teachers. God knows what it knows. It knows two things not: Christ's resurrection and Paul. By the way, the Shepherd of Hermas does not only not know about Paul, he has 10 different titles for Christ, but nowhere in these 60 chapters does he touch on Christ's resurrection. So
also, isn't the term gospel missing? It's not used.
Too.
Yeah, so that's a Pauline innovation, or at least we associate it with Paul, right?
Yeah, but isn't it strange that we have Christian writings, foundational Christian writings, in the central places like Syria and in Rome?
Yeah, and Paul's absent, the resurrection's not there.
And there's a link.
Okay.
And that's the link which occurred to me, that there's a link between the absence of Paul and the absence of writings Christian writings that do not talk about Christ's resurrection. By the way, if you read the New Testament not from beginning to end, because that is a reductional proposition, that we have to start reading our New Testament, the canonical one, from the Gospels, through Acts, or through Paul and then Acts, or the other way around. But if we read the way we have got it today, from back to forth, half of the New Testament, you do not come across Paul, and now you can guess what else you don't come about. You don't stumble about the resurrection of Christ. The resurrection of Christ, like a Pauline Christianity, is imprinted into our brains and our hearts and our stomachs through the order of the canonical New Testament, and through the elimination of those writings where neither Paul nor Christ's resurrection appears. It's a reductional decision to exclude precisely those writings. So when after I had read everything in the first 3 centuries, one night I woke up and thought, oh Jesus, now the manuscript is with the publisher, but I think I've got a major mistake. I need to reverse the order of the datings. This simply doesn't fit. And so I played around and I tried how it would be if Paul, for example, was a niche product and a niche person, known to some people, loved by some, hated by others. And I asked myself, when was that niche making more impact? And here, that's the only reason how I stumbled upon Marcion of Sinope, because it appeared to me quite clearly that as soon as Marcion brought together a 10-letter collection of Paul was on the scenery, and people started engaging with him. And from that engagement, we have then writings like the Epistle of Barnabas, Barnabas linking somehow with a Pauline tradition. We have a canonical attempt, I think an earlier attempt to model with these 10 letters. So my timeline completely changed, and I give you the rough timeline which I've got, with which I've worked, and the more I'm working on it, the more this timeline establishes itself. And when I published this first book on Christ's resurrection, which then got us a new subtitle, I had to submit a new manuscript, of course, the dating of the New Testament. Since then, I have the following timeline, very simple. The gospel material must have been written earlier than Marcion, because Marcion potentially made use of 1 or 2 sources for his gospel. So that's in line with traditional scholarship, which claimed that there was a gospel in the 1st century, maybe even a source of loquia, of sayings of the Lord. Could be. I have no doubt some material must have derived from the 1st century into the hands of Marcion, or early 2nd century. I mean, don't press me on those dates. We don't know that. Pauline letters, equally. He made use of 2 collections, earlier collections of letters, but these letters were much smaller than the canonical letters later. He brought these 2 collections, a collection of 7 letters and of 3 letters together, bound them together, and here was his 10-letter collection. And that's the collection which I have tried to reconstruct together with the team. And from my view, these 2 separate entities of the gospel and of these 10 letters apparently went out again to the same people, some of the same people where he got the material from. And they started revising it further. So they based their revisions on what they've got. So it was a giving and taking between sources and the people who moved their revised versions of these sources back to the people where they got the stuff from. I mean, that's what you would expect in a communication process.
As you're painting this picture, just so we have a date in our mind, you're talking early second, 120s, 130s AD?
Well, Marcion, we know from several sources, has moved after the Second Jewish War, that's the year 135, from his place where he worked, which was Sinope. And by the way, I think he was part of a Jewish community in Sinope, because the Jewish community in Sinope was famous for his textual revisions of Jewish work. So at the same time, as a contemporary of Marcion was Aquila, who was the Jewish textual scholar in Sinope, and who was reworking on the Septuagint, so a revised version of the Septuagint. So there was a lot of textual work going on, and people tried to write stuff and to reorganize Jewish life after the Second Jewish War. So he was either displaced or he made his move deliberately to Rome, started what the scholars of the time told or tell us, a didaskaleon, a school. And if Clement of Alexandria is correct, he was even the oldest chap of those Christians who, after that war, so after 135, between 135 and 140 maybe, started schools for Christians and non-Christians maybe, and for Jews in Rome. Which also gives us already an indication of where these people came from. So these were certainly Jews or former Jews who still held on to Rome as the cultural center. So they certainly didn't side with the people who revolted against the Romans.
Right.
Yeah. So we have a Romanizing tendency, let's say. Yeah. And that we could trace that in other writings, but that's not for today, or maybe later. Yeah. So we have 135, let's say 140. We have this collection of Marcion, the Gospel, 10 Pauline letters. No acts. Yeah. Not yet.
If I may bring this up, just because you know this book, Richard Pervo, who I wish he was still around today to be able to, pick his brain and see what he thinks about this thing, because it doesn't really matter at the end of the day, but it'd be interesting to see how someone who's invested so much time in trying to learn about Acts, he makes an argument somewhere, and this was before this new wave, I'd say this new wave of Marcion push came about. That is, one of his dating techniques is to highlight that he believes, a few scholars have made the point that there was a collection of Paul's letters, and they estimated, I don't know how solid they made this argument. It might have been off of a few patristics they think were using Paul's letters that now has been kind of questioned by your school. But he put it like 100, 110, which forces Acts, because I think he does a really good job of showing 70-something examples of Acts using Paul, like knows Paul, but then changes it on purpose in various ways from what we have in canonical Paul, of course. But if Marcion's the first one that we actually have this collection that we can really nail down, that forces it later if you take that approach that Pervo's taken. So I just wanted to drop that nugget in there as we're going along, that Acts' dependence upon Pauline something, letters-wise, would mean it's after Paul's letters seem to have been circulating and been aware of this author. So
yeah, and this shifts a bit the timeline. I mean, those scholars like Pervo or Tyson or even Knut Backhaus, that's the name which hasn't been mentioned, but he is the last one who has all his life extensively written on Acts. But he has published 2 articles about the dating of Acts, and he has published a big monograph on the questions of the dating of Acts just a few years ago, 2-3 years ago. And Knut makes the argument, and although I think he is, I'm not saying conservative in a negative sense. On the contrary, it's meant in a very positive sense. So He tries to elaborate on the old theories, right? And he rejects particularly Matthias Klinghart's work on Marcion. Nevertheless, even he moves the dating of Acts into the first third of the 2nd century. So far away from where it's been placed before. Right. But all of these people, if they want to engage now with the reconstruction that I'm suggesting and I'm proposing, and if one were to base one's views, I think one would need to make the same shift as you just mentioned. So the same arguments that were used for placing Acts in the beginning of the 2nd century would simply need to shift a bit more and to say, well, if Acts does what these people have shown it does, namely that it makes use of Paul, and what I can show is that Acts is not only making use of Paul in the earlier, at least in the earliest attestation that we have, which is Marcion's text, because we have no other earlier attestation. Right. So we can't make any sense of what could have been before, right?
Right.
What we've got is, if Marcion is the source for the canonical Pauline texts, and we may come to that, why I'm of that opinion. If that's the case, and if Acts is making use not of the Marcionite version of the earlier version, but of the canonical version, then Acts must be after 140, probably after 150. And see, that ties in quite well with the external attestation. Irrespective of all my research that I've done, people over the last 20 years have recognized, and that's also why Knut Backhaus moves, why Pervo moves, why Tyson moved, why other people moved, right? People have recognized that the earliest attestation for Acts is Dionysius of Corinth. Not Justin Martyr. So Justin Martyr, we are in the years 160. With Dionysius of Corinth, this is a contemporary of Irenaeus. So we are in the 170s. So if there is no attestation of Acts before 170, that explains to you why I'm so skeptical about Acts being written in the 1st century, let alone in the beginning of the 2nd century. The problem is, if you've got a book of that size, and even if this book were written by a gospel author, and that ties on the other knot, the earlier you place the gospels, the more problematic it becomes that the work of a gospel writer isn't being read, just the gospel is being read. How on earth can that be?
Yeah.
And so the absence of Paul, the absence of Acts that appears for the first time in, even if we want to date it a bit earlier, in the 160s, 170s. I think it's impossible that a book like that was just hidden under the pillows.
No, I'm with you. I agree. I think there's a very important point you're bringing up here. And you're giving like the earliest date we can be certain it appears 170s. Be certain.
That's what it is.
And so we know when it had to be written by, but the question is how much earlier can we push it? And this is the difficulty, the struggle that we have is it terminus antiquem, terminus antiquo? You know what I'm talking about. Is there a time in which makes the best sense why we should date it too?
My view is you can date it whenever you want prior to that, because we have no evidence. So that's the black box, right? So people can place it whenever they want. We can't dispute that. It's not a matter of discussion. It's a matter of stomach or recipes. Or
what about
whatever.
The Josephus stuff, though? I mean, there's a lot. That
is a post-quem, not an antequem.
Right.
That we know, I would say, it cannot have been written before 93, 94.
Right.
Fair enough.
Okay.
But between 94 And 170, there's a bit of a gap.
Yeah.
And my rule of thumb would be every year you date this writing earlier. The gap of not being quoted and of Paul not being alive and present in the minds of people and the hearts of people is the burden for those people who date these texts early and earlier. I think you have good ground to say, well, from 140 at least, there's the splash with the 10-letter collection of Marcion where people start debating Paul. So I think you can narrow the frame to say, well, it makes sense if that work of Acts was written sometime after 140 and before 170. Narrows it already by 30, 40 years. That's not a bad window. And then we might say, oh, well, Polycarp of Smyrna engages with Acts potentially, with all the problems around the letter of Polycarp. We might come on that if somebody wants to know something about it. But that would be 150s, 160. Yeah, but you can see the more we get closer to 160, 170, Acts seems to have a place. But the earlier you go, I think you're in deep trouble. Sorry about that.
No, you're right. I think it's kind of like the Papias thing, to give an analogy for a viewer. Papias explicitly discusses two, well, really he says three. I mean, and then he also has a logia he talks about, but Mark, he mentions a mark. It may not be a mark that we have, but it might just be a mark of some sort. And it might be a version of Matthew that, like you said, there's a lot of give and take. There's constant stuff that's going on. And who knows what kind of polishing of these texts take form over the time. But he never mentions a Luke. He never mentions a John. He doesn't have the Gospels.
I would disagree on John.
Okay.
Because the problem is when people talk about Papias, they usually only take note of the few fragments that Eusebius is giving us. Mm-hmm. When I started the business in 1978, sorry for being so old, right? Must be ages for other people. I published as my diploma the annotated bibliography on Papias in a first work with the fragments edited by my supervisor Hübner, and that was 1984, and we have over 20 fragments of Papias in this collection. And then we have a year later a second collection that was published in Germany, and ever since then we have collections of Papias, like the Italian edition and so forth, right? So we have a good range of fragments of Papias. But one of the fragments which is well attested and in all these collections, but isn't being read by the usual lay people or even by my usual colleagues, right, is the fragment which is only preserved in Latin, but nevertheless, it's well attested. And it talks about, and again, irrespective of how you translate this crude Latin, but what cannot be denied, he talks about the engagement between the gospel writer John and Marcion, which was a big stumbling block for scholars in the 19th century, even for people like Harnack, who says, well, this is so anachronistic from his view, anachronistic because he thought, oh, John is well established. He has written his gospel in the first century, maybe at the end of the first century. But it's still anachronistic if this fragment by Papias talks about John and Marcion having a discussion about who has got the true gospel.
May I chime in here?
Yeah.
You just said John and Marcion.
Yeah.
So this fragment, that would date Papias later then, correct?
That's what I would say. for the last 20 years.
Wow. Okay. So this is something, somehow I fell asleep in our last dialogues and didn't realize you were saying this. Okay.
Absolutely.
So when
and it's not just me saying, I mean, this is public domain. I mean, you look at these editions of Papias's fragments, when we have more than just Eusebius gives us.
Okay.
And the interesting thing, in the 19th century, one has published Marcion's fragment on John by excluding the name of Marcion and putting in other people's names. But I tell you, and we have a range of manuscripts for this fragment, in all of the manuscripts available until today. All. There is Marcion in the fragment. Not a single other name. So that's well established, which means Papias must have written after 135, probably after 140.
Wow. Jeez.
That also gives us that the Gospel of John belongs to that negotiation process between Marcion and the Gospel writers, the other Gospel writers.
What does that do in your view then? And I'm sorry, I'm going back and forth. We'll get to the Q&A. I promise you, just so everybody knows, Dr. Vinzent told me he has a little bit of time, so we'll be able to actually get to your question. I really feel like a child in a candy shop right now asking these questions. I'm very fortunate. So then what do you do with Eusebius, the scholars who have said, well, Eusebius is putting him back here at this time? How do you deal with the different timings Papias is supposedly writing? And why do you choose that one? You know what I mean?
Well, I think as a number of other scholars have said, Eusebius might have skipped that text on John for that very purpose, because he was very skeptical about Papias, not about the gospel writings or what he says about John and the others, right? But he wanted, because of the millenniarism, right? So that Papias believes in 1,000 years reign, and Eusebius holds that for nonsense. Yeah. and so he places Papias pretty early, yeah, and shifts him to the beginning of the second century rather than later, and to displace him a bit from this crazy idea of which he thinks also in Irenaeus is a mistake. Yeah.
Wow. Okay. So then we can't use Papias then to be trying to date early. We have to be dealing around the time of Marcion,
which also has a big impact on the question of dating Matthew and Mark, because look, Papias is being used for dating Mark and Matthew into the first century.
Right.
That was the basis for dating Luke into the first century. That was the basis for placing Acts in the first century, and the whole nonsense starts.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, he's a huge.
It's all falling apart.
Papias he's definitely utilized. He's very important in that scheme, like you just said. So let me ask you this.
I give you two more writings, or sort of writings, which serve the same purpose for the early datings.
Okay.
Those are the Ignatian letters, and it's the Didache. I just had an email exchange with one of my very respected colleagues this morning, who has sent me a draft article that he wrote for a forthcoming publication on baptism in early Christianity. And he said to me, Markus, have a look at it. I'm not sure about the datings, right? And so on footnote 5, he says, I'm going along with the traditional dating because of the Didache. So I wrote back to him this yesterday evening, and I said to him, well, you're really misled, because the Didache that we place into the first century, late first century, early second century, might have originated at those times. However, the Didache that we have, and again, all the editions that we have here are pretty standard. However, we have a very solid German edition from the Wissenschaftliche Buchgesellschaft, and the author is Klaus Wengst. And he is one of the very few who has not only recognized, as the others, that the Didache has come down to us in two different reception streams. So we have a version A and a version B. The oldest version that we've got comes from the same manuscript where the Ignatian letters are being found. And First Clement is being found. And Polycarp's letter to the Philippians is being found. The same manuscript. And that's the manuscript from Jerusalem from the 12th century. Now, in that manuscript, we are not talking about the 7 letters of Ignatius. We are talking about the 13th letter of Ignatius, which means, and I think there's no dispute about the 13 letters today, that the 13 letters are a revised version, a broadened version of the earlier 7-letter collection of Ignatius, which means the text of Ignatius in the manuscript in Jerusalem is a heavily redacted version. Not only that, 6 new letters in the 4th century have been added to those 7 earlier letters that Eusebius knows. But even the 7 letters that Eusebius knows are in a totally different form. They are what people say, they are biblicized, they are gospelized. In every second phrase of the letters, of the 7 letters, in every second phrase, you have a quote from Jesus' mouth, right, or from the Old Testament. So people were feeling in the 4th century that Ignatian letters that are having, almost no quotes from the New Testament, you simply cannot hand down to the future generations. So they were rewriting these 7 letters and bolted onto the 7 letters 6 more letters that updated the discussion. Now, in this manuscript, that's the oldest Greek manuscript that we have for the letter to Polycarp's letter to the Philippians, the Didache, and a few other writings like First Clement.
Now, do you believe? I hear a lot about First Clement too. But go ahead.
Now, do you believe we can trust, let's put it the other way around. If we can trust all writings as much as we can trust the Ignatian letters, for which we have comparative other writings earlier, and we know that not the 13 letter, but only 7 letters date from earlier than the 4th century. If that's the case, how much can we trust in the textual stability of the other texts? Now, Klaus Wengst has shown that the other version that we have of the Didache in Ethiopic, a pretty late manuscript, but in Ethiopic, but the Ethiopic text coincides with the Coptic version, which is probably 4th century and not 12th century. Now, in that stream, the Didache is much less gospelized. The big chunks where today we have the parallels to the Gospel of Matthew are missing. Mm-hmm. Now, who on earth would copy the Didache and cut out New Testament parallels?
Yeah, that's a good point.
Makes no sense. The nature is, as with the Ignatian letters, that like the Ignatian letters are being inserted with biblical quotations to make it more, let's say, harmonized with the canonical texts. The same happens with the Didache. So whether the Didache ever had the Lord's Prayer, whether it ever had those Matthew parallels, is a riddle. Mm-hmm. To use the Didache to date Matthew early is like jumping a bungee jump without a jump or without a bungee. Yeah,
that's funny.
It's up in the air.
Yeah,
it's the fabrication. It's following the fabrication that in the 4th century took place to make these texts link up with the canonical texts. And now we today reverse the order and say, because these texts have canonical parallels, the canonical texts must be early. How crazy that is.
Another one too is it the Gospel of Nicodemus, which I know is later, but there's this idea of Pontius Pilate in there's something mentioned by Justin Martyr when he references the emperor, which he's not really writing to the emperor. I think this is more of an internal Christian text, but in it, he acts like, oh, you could just go in your own archives and you could see Pontius Pilate wrote about these things. And that text, which we have this tradition that goes all the way to Eusebius, it has hints at the body being stolen or these ideas that we find in Matthew. And some scholars think, well, maybe that text does know about Matthew, but that's probably, I don't know what your thoughts are on that or how far you've delved into that, because by the time Justin Martyr writes, I don't think you're saying Matthew doesn't already exist. I think you do think it's floating, right, around?
Yeah, no, I think when Justin writes, we have Matthew around, yeah.
Gotcha.
In whichever form Matthew existed, we're not absolutely sure. But maybe a pre-harmonized version of Matthew already existed, yeah.
Okay, shifting gears because we're at 1 hour and 3 minutes, and I have one more mainly focused on Acts because you and I can actually go and go and go. And I mean, I really love listening and hearing and thinking through these things. We should do this again. I really hope we can go.
Pleasure.
Yeah, I love learning from you. Acts. Maybe briefly tell us what your thoughts about Luke and Acts, and separate author, same author, because it's really odd to me how an author ends a book and the same day there's an ascension and then another book starts and then there's 40 days and then there's an ascension. And I kind of wrap my head and go, huh. Yeah, I don't know if I wouldn't write my story and end it with the same day and then start another story. And then, but then again, maybe ancient authors had a different thing. I'd like to hear your thoughts about this, but also if we can keep in mind, I want to get from you internal evidence in Acts that you think shows awareness of Marcion, like the author is trying to rebut or attack or argue against. So if there's any internal evidence, because we've been talking about a lot of external to the biblical account material that helps us kind of understand the dating issues and struggles, but internally to Acts, is there awareness to you that really settles this issue?
Well, it's always easier to talk about external evidence than internal evidence. Internal evidence is mostly a question of interpretation and reading, but I'm happy to shift to internal evidence. But before we do that, just one last external evidential question or evidential observation. People have always known, and we still know it today, and we have no evidence to the contrary, that Acts and Luke as a gospel have never been in a manuscript transmission together. So whenever Acts is being put into a manuscript, and you still can see it from the big manuscripts, for the codices from the 4th and the 5th century, we have the New Testament in 4 subgroups, if you like. One is the group of 4 Gospels. And the second group is a group which is Acts, always together with the so-called Catholic letters. So with James, Peter, John, and Jude. And they are a compound, if you like, or a sub-collection in the New Testament. When you, for example, see in the large codices in the 4th and 5th century, so Codex Alexandrinus, Sinaiticus, and so forth, you can see that sometimes the order of writings change when you compare these big codices. But they only change the order of the subgroups, not of individual writings. So we have always the 4 Gospels in the beginning, even when internally those Gospels sometimes in manuscripts and papyri change the order, or in the minds of people change the order, but they're always together. Acts is always together. So in some manuscripts, we have the 4 Gospels followed by Paul's letters, and then followed by Acts only. But Acts with the Catholic letters. And at the end, we have Revelation. In 2 of the other major codices of the 4th, 5th centuries, we have the 4 Gospels, and then we have Acts, but again, with the Catholic letters, followed by Paul's letters, followed by Revelation. So in no manuscripts, in no papyrus, in nothing, ever, do we have Luke bound together with Acts or Acts bound together with Luke. They're separate.
That's a pretty big deal. I mean, even I know you're dealing with external, and this is an important point before we move into internal, because when I'm reading Acts theologically, I know this is interpretation, but it sounds so proto-Catholicizing. And I think Pervo, used the same term.
Exactly.
It is absolutely in the vein of this later Christian kind of idea that I see over and over in the text. And that makes a ton of sense. So you're saying, though, we just need to we should not be so confident in linking it to this gospel we call Luke today. Why do scholars conflate them? And before we get an internal evidence,
I think the Catholic redaction that put together the New Testament at some point, they did a great job in combining Acts first with the Catholic letters. Why? When you look into Acts, the first 8 chapters of Acts, Paul is absent. The protagonists in Acts, in the opening of Acts, are exactly those 3 people that reappear in Acts 15. These are the 3 pillars, as they are called in Galatians. Exactly. James, Peter, and John. And of these people, the Catholic letters are the support of what Acts is reporting in its opening. And that makes so much sense that in 2 of our major codices in the 5th and 4th centuries, the Gospels are followed by Acts and then by the Catholic letters, and only then by the letters of Paul, because that is the internal logic. Now we come to internal questions. That is the internal logic of Acts, which gives us first a hint of Christ with the ascension, then gives us the protagonists, the 3, and then it gives us the letters of these people, prior to giving us the story of Paul and the letters of Paul that follow the letters of those 3 pillars, plus the brother of the Lord, Jude. So that's the outline. Now, the redactors who have made that choice, because for them these Catholic letters were so important, more important potentially than Paul, they had the second choice to make. How do we now link potentially a writing of which they knew that it was a rather recent writing? Maybe it was only produced for the canonical New Testament, but this is a hypothesis. We have no proof for that. But what is quite clear is they had the second job to do, namely to link the first subgroup of 4 Gospels with the subgroup of Acts and the Catholic letters. Why they have chosen Luke and not John or Matthew or Mark? And that gives me the first hint that Acts is an anti-Marcionite work. Because they've chosen out of the 4 Gospels, the Gospel that people like Tertullian knew, and also Irenaeus knew extremely well, was the Gospel closest to Marcion's Gospel. Literally a copy of it, whichever way. Either Marcion copied literally from Luke or Luke from Marcion. But this is the Gospel which is like a mirror Gospel, as Epiphanius later deals with it. So to pick Luke's Gospel and then to use this Gospel to move it away from Marcion and to link it to the story as we are getting the story unfolded in Acts makes total sense.
And it tames Paul. It might be Paul's the hero, but Paul gets completely railroaded in that story.
And that explains why the Gospel of Marcion, which is so Pauline in its original structure before it was revised, and Acts is then... And now comes that if our theory is correct with the Marcionite priority of the Gospel compared to Luke at least, yeah, then it makes absolute sense that those elements that are missing from Luke's gospel in Marcion's gospel are not something Marcion has skipped off, but rather the other way, are the reductional additions to Marcion's gospel. And these reductional additions, they fit and link with Acts. Knut Backhaus, in his work, rejects the Marcionite ideas on the grounds of exactly those links. He says, when Matthias Klingenhardt claims that the preface of Luke, which links with the preface of Acts, or vice versa, because it's the same addressee. The preface says, now I'm sending you the second book, right? So there is a first book, right? And Luke has the same person, Theophilus, to whom the book is dedicated. Yeah, so it's quite clear the redactors want to bind those two books together through the prefaces. Knut Backhaus says he rejects this theory by Matthias Klingenhardt for external reasons. He says there is no single papyrus or codex ever where Acts and Luke is without its preface. And I have to say, this is wishful thinking. This is making an argument from nothing. Why? I've checked all the papyri and all the manuscripts for both Luke and Acts, and there is not one single manuscript or papyrus from the first 250 years that gives us either Luke 1, the preface, or Acts and the preface.
You mean it's missing?
No, there is no evidence. We don't have a codex or we don't have a papyrus that has the preface.
So that could have been added later, your point.
See? It's rather, I mean, this external evidence rather supports Matthias Klinghardt's suggestion. Because if we take the earliest evidence that we have, and this is Marcion's collection, all the witnesses that we have know that Marcion's gospel did not have this preface. And if Marcion's Luke didn't have this preface, there's evidence that this preface didn't exist or was left out by Marcion, but that doesn't make much sense. Now you see how things come together. So internally, if the prefaces were a later addition, and Matthias has written widely upon it and shown to what extent the preface in Luke and the preface in Acts are anti-Marcionite texts. And Knut Backhaus even needs to assert that even stylistically, the prefaces don't seem to fit the rest of the gospel.
Yeah, even Alexander Loveday points out that the Greek in the first 4 verses of the preface are radically different than, and the term she uses is Septuagintal Greek. So the remainder, what you get after that is radically different from before, at least in Luke.
Yeah. And what is so interesting when we now come to stylistic elements, you will see that all the texts which are different between Marcion's gospel and the canonical Lucan gospel, those additional texts in the canonical text are akin to Acts. So we have stylistic evidence of word material, of expressions, of styles, of homiletic elements and so forth, right? Of storytelling, where the one part links up with the other. And now we come to the end of Luke and the beginning of Acts. That there is the end of Jesus being lifted into the heavens. is missing in Marcion's Luke. We have no such idea of ascension in Marcion's Gospel. And
now why would he redact that though? You know what I mean? Like, I don't think
point. It would have served him.
Right.
So it would have played to his idea of Christ not being a physical person.
Right.
So no point in taking that out.
It's very glorified.
But a lot of ideas of putting it into the text, because that is the beginning of Acts. So they might differ in datings of how long that period was in the Gospel and in Acts. Maybe different traditions, I don't know.
Yeah.
But I think here you're right. People were rather gracious with dating of and days and works or whatever. But the end of Luke, which is different from Marcion's Luke, fits the opening, in theory at least, to the beginning of Acts. But we have more of these similarities, right?
So
baptism, by the way, what I was asked this morning to respond to, baptism is a very good question, yeah? Baptism in Acts is a form of remission of sins.
Right.
This idea that first of all, baptism is missing in Marcion's Gospel, and it is missing in Marcion's Paul. Marcion's Paul only knows of Christ being baptized, but that people are being baptized is missing. And so when baptizein is used in Marcion's Gospel or in Paul, it's washing of hands, it's purity. There's no idea that people are being baptized in Marcion.
That is interesting.
And the idea that salvation by Christ is by a remission of sins is totally absent in Marcion's New Testament. But it's a feature of the canonical text in Acts as it is in the canonical Gospels and in the Catholic letters. And so you can see, I mean, I could carry on for the next 10 hours, right? To show the parallels between textually and content-wise, of Acts and of the canonical additions to Luke and the other parts of the canonical New Testament. Let me give you a last element. We have one chapter or one or two chapters in Acts that are crucial for dating. Crucial for the dating of the Pauline letters. And those are chapters 18 and 19. And all our so-called hard chronology for Paul is derived from these two chapters. All of it. Take away, if you haven't got Acts being written in the first century, and placing Paul through chapters 18 and 19. So we have the story of Aquila, Priscilla, and we have the expulsion of the Christians by in the years 40, 41, and a few more. All the elements for dating Paul into the first century derive from chapters 18 and 19 in Acts. So there's a deliberate attempt in Acts on the one side to downplay Paul, and on the other side to make him a historical person from the first century.
There's a lot of questions I have from that, but let's get to Q&A here. I just want to make a timeline in my head. You imagine that Marcion, of course, had a gospel, had the 10 letters of Paul, which he's working off two earlier collections, 1.3, 1.7, and he has 10. So here's Marcion with the first canon of Scripture. And I'm just using that for people's minds to get an understanding. And then there is engagement and competition. And someone explodes his gospel, making it larger in competition with Marcion, which ends up ultimately becoming our canonical Luke. Ultimately, it might have still looked a little different than what we have today in its final form, but it's ultimately what we have today, in your view. somewhere after the time that Marcion already has popularized his Evangelion, his gospel. The letters of Paul, of course, start to take off and have lots of debates surrounding them that we can actually anchor in external sources, not just internal theology debate, argument of interpretation, but like externally is when we start seeing real debates about Paul take place. And Acts, you think, comes even later than this Gospel of Luke in combat with, or how do you place Acts as far as time-wise?
Yeah, I think the timeline was as follows. Acts is a reaction to the publication of Marcion's collection, because originally I think he wasn't even intending to publish his collection. He has put together this gospel out of his sources. He has put together the 10 letters of Paul as a collection, but that's what it was.
Mm-hmm.
And that's also the reason why the people who use Paul's letters are not necessarily making use of a collection of gospels. The first who talks about the total collection of all of that is Irenaeus. That's almost 180. Yeah. So I think the way was that when people were making use of this and redacted the Marcionite Gospel into Luke, yeah, as a reaction to these entertainments and making use of his material, Marcion was forced to react. And that's why he put together his New Testament as a solid compound of gospel plus 10 letters plus his preface. And in this preface, which is being reported upon by Tertullian, he is pretty aggressive because he talks about these rogue copies. And he talks about that the rogue copies were given 2 names of apostles and 2 names of students of apostles. So he knew about the 4 names, Matthew and John as the apostles, and Mark and Luke as the apostles of Gospels. You wouldn't make that up if you hadn't got knowledge of it. Right. And that's what he knows in his preface. And that's where he puts together his collection and hopes to get through and to make a case that this is the New Testament. Now, that explains that at that time, only in reaction now to his New Testament, people start putting together the 4 Gospels, put new letters of Paul to the 10 pseudo-Paulites, as we now know today.
Right.
The pastorals and Hebrews. So no letter today anybody would credit, or not anybody, but the majority would not credit to Paul. Plus the Catholic letters with Acts as a bolstering of the Catholic redaction. And that's how we get to a New Testament and also to Acts, which is, I think, a counterproduction to Marcion's New Testament. And that's why we have the preface in Luke and in Acts as the linking of the 2 major collections that we have in the canonical New Testament. And so my suggestion is, in the 150s, 160s, these writings were put together, the redaction was undertaken, and then as our first witness, we have in the 170s Dionysius, and in the 180s, we have Irenaeus, who then also only makes use for the first time in a broader sense. He's the very first who makes use of a larger quotes from Acts, because Dionysius of Corinth only gives us a hint, yeah. Whereas Irenaeus makes full use of Acts. He's the first to do so in church history, and he does it within making use of the entire New Testament that we know of.
They're manufacturing narratives in competition, and Absolutely. It looks like what you're suggesting is Marcion comes on the block clearly influential, clearly viral, clearly having serious like he's making waves in the communities of Christian circles. And this is before they really like completely divorced from each other and set up shop in complete different areas. They're like, you're going to the same churches with a lot of these people. You're brushing shoulders with a lot of these Christians.
Well,
so
look, they're brushing shoulders still further on.
Right.
I mean, we have a letter in the letter collection of Cyprian that states that the Novatians, the Marcionites, and others in Rome, together with the Catholic communities, are still having sacramental communion. That's mid-3rd century. So forget about what the imaginaries of Irenaeus in France, forget about the imaginaries of Tertullian in Carthage, and people who have written about Tertullian's biography, they say Tertullian had almost no knowledge about the church in Rome. So forget about those imaginaries which we take for granted today, right?
Right.
I think the reality is more like what you've just said. These people were engaging with each other. They didn't always like each other. I mean, take us. We don't like each other's theories. I talk about Knut Backhaus. He talks about sometimes, like with Judas Lieu, we turn around and say, oh, we like each other and we have learned a lot from each other. But that's a process of learning from each other by being different. And that's what it was.
Yeah, it just seems like your point is they're manufacturing this stuff after there's a serious issue with who's taking off, who's getting virality. And we see it on YouTube. You see someone who makes a video, popular figure, that video is making waves. Then there are reaction videos to the video. And those reaction videos to the video who try to act like they all along had the correct understanding or whatever, and they're trying to, undermine the original person. You can see this kind of tit for tat happening. I just wish we had a time machine. That's all. That's all I wish. Now, I'm not asking for a lot. I'm just asking.
But you see, communication doesn't change much. The way we communicate as human beings. Yeah. Exactly.
Okay, I'm going to get to our super chats. It's been I've been hogging up the space here, but I really do appreciate you painting the narrative. And I know that we could get into way more details. We could get into some of the internal evidences that you've noticed, that you've seen other scholars point to, things like that. Maybe we do a round 2 if you're okay with it, because I really would like to get into the weeds. Yeah, and maybe that'll give you time also to prepare for like specifics, because having all of that.
Yeah, I mean, if you give me a list of let's say of these questions that are being asked today, which we can't work out, then we have a second session where we straight away we go into question and answers.
Yeah. Okay, here we go. Bakken, thank you for the super chat. I hope you're still sticking around. Sorry for the long wait. Do you think Marcion created the Paul persona? Do we have any contemporaries of Saul calling him Paul? Could Marcion be the sea trader of Luke Acts?
I like the image. Well, I think I would rather think it's the other way around, because in the Marcionite letters of Paul is not really a persona. I mean, yes, he's a writer, but he makes pretty little out of himself. He gives us some indications of who he is, where he comes from, but his interest is not himself. I mean, all these major speeches about his sufferings and what he's gone through and where he's coming from and where he's going to is canonical. You will not find those indications. And again, I think Tertullian would be the least who does not mention those elements on Paul, because they would have played so much into his argument. But no, he doesn't talk about it. I think it was absent from the text themselves. So I think it's the other way around. Luke Acts is the first painting, and that's why I don't believe that Saul is prior to Paul. I think Saul is the invention, the fiction of whoever was Luke. Likewise, I think it's pure fiction.
Mm-hmm. Michael Kashinash, his work, Better Call Paul Saul. I think he sold me on that one.
Yeah. That's why I called my book From Paul to Saul.
Yeah, that's what I always say. Bakken is, I think that the author of Acts is doing Septuagint imitation here with the Saul character and changing him into Paul. But that's Michael Kashinash actually goes into the history of what scholars thought that he had two names. One was a Roman name and one was the Jewish name. And he goes through all that and just cuts through it and goes, You know what's more likely is just he's a literary invention here.
Absolutely. I fully agree with him.
Yeah. Thank you so much. Really appreciate that. Doc Pluromanaut, thank you so much for the super chat and being a member, both of you. What's your control for directionality? How do you distinguish expansion from abbreviation? And what evidence would falsify Marcionite priority?
Look, one of my methodological approaches is always looking for evidence against my position. That's from where I come, and that's where I learn from. So I give little on people who always try just to support their own views. The problem is with directionality. First, the majority of textual evidence that we have within Christianity, outside Christianity, in Judaism, but also in classical studies and classical works, is that until we come to the later 3rd, 4th, 5th centuries, we almost have no abbreviations when it comes to texts and textual developments. As we have just seen with Ignatius, it grows from, let's say, 3 to 7 letters, which is probably not as much acknowledged yet, but from 7 to 13 letters, everybody agrees. So it's a growing. Canonical Paul, everybody agrees that less than 14 letters were the original part. However, how much letters we have, there might be a bit of a dispute, but nobody disputes that the letter collection of Paul was growing over time. And most scholars accept that only 7 letters might be authentic, even if you take the old school now, right? So not my view on the relation with the Marcionite Paul. No, just take normal Pauline scholarship, right? Or any Pauline scholar. They will say Paul's collection grew to 7 letters, 3 more letters, the Deutero-Paulines were added, then 3 more Pseudo-Paulines were added, the pastoral letters, and then even Hebrews was added. So we have at the end a collection of 14 letters. So expansion is the norm. And that's not only true for the number of writings, it is also true for the textual corpus of a writing. So we can see that chapters are being added, for example, to the Ignatian letters. Text is being added. And that's just one comparative. But you can also see, if you go into Cicero's collection, the collection grows. The collection of letters grows, the text grows. So that's the external. And you can see, I'm always prefer first external evidence and to see parallels. Mm-hmm. The external evidence, I think, talks or is rather against, or is no evidence for falsifying priority of Marcionite's collection, but rather endorses it. And that's one of the reasons why Nina Livesey has published her book on Paul, because she's seen exactly that from looking into the classical world. Here we go. So if you look into classical examples, it supports Marcionite priority rather than the other way around. When it comes to internal evidence, again, I think, here we are on more secure grounds. To abbreviate the canonical text to the text that is witnessed today for the Marcionite collection, ask Jack Bull, you would need to be trained more like a surgical chirurgeon or a surgical doctor than you can be. It is impossible. I give you one example. We have Epeter. He said, so a simple expression, over 600 times in the canonical New Testament. Although you would expect this is a form which you find more in gospel material than in letters. Because in letters, we don't have too many people who speak to each other, so less dialogue. So that somebody has the expression Epeter, he said, is not common. It is, however, present even in Paul's letters, in the canonical Paul. Now, when you look into the Marcionite New Testament, there is no epator. Whenever Jesus talks, he talks in the present and not in the past. So Jesus says, but he does not say in the past. He did. It's not he said, but he says. And if there is a saying in the past, a different verb is being used. He announced or he gave, but never he said. Now, to remove all these instances in Luke's gospel, where Luke has that Jesus said, or where Paul in the canonical version has this word he said, is impossible. I mean, how and why? Why would a redactor like Marcion remove this insignificant word, an insignificant form? I give you another example. Ede is a small word and means in English already. So when I'm not sure that Derek has used the word tonight, it would have probably occurred to me. So there are people like Derek who do not use already. I have colleagues that use already in every third sentence because they're a bit more moving and more dynamic than Derek, which is hardly possible, but different styles, yeah? People use whatever small words they use. Now, this ede is being used pretty frequently in canonical Luke and also in canonical Paul, over 60 times in the New Testament. Each time, verses that are witnessed where ede is being used in the canonical Luke, ede is missing in Tertullian's witness, in Epiphanius' witness. Ede is missing in Marcion's Gospel. But it is also missing in Marcion's Paul. That small word was not, like Derek's language, was not of Marcion's language, neither in the Gospel nor in his letters to Paul, of Paul. Now, to remove such a small word, each time it occurs, is impossible. But it is more likely that a redactor who's used to this word sprinkles it into Luke, into Matthew, into wherever, and also into Paul. Behind is sometimes a bit of a theological endeavor because ede also presses more. So it's a rhetorical style, it's a theological style. It gives a bit of apocalyptic flavor to these texts. And I think that was the reason why this guy, whoever was the redactor, he must have come from this kind of slightly apocalyptic language. So just two examples, yeah?
Yeah.
Or last example, if you forge letters, pseudo-Pauline letters, and you address out of 3 letters that you forge, 2 to Timothy and 1 to Titus, I think you would make sure that the names of the writers to which these letters are addressed by Paul, so Titus and Timothy, that they are also present in Paul's letters, to link the new letters with the old ones. Now you've got a problem, because in Marcion's letter collection, Titus appears, but Timothy is never present. Never, ever. In the canonical text, Timothy is not only present, he is a co-writer of several of Paul's letters. If Marcion, as most people believe, did not even know about the existence of the pastoral letters, I guess these pastoral letters were not written yet. Why would he remove Timothy? I mean, even if he knew about these letters, why would he remove Timothy but leave Titus if he knew the letters? If you say he removed Timothy because he didn't like the pastoral letters, no point. He would have removed the mention of Titus 2. To remove just one of these two doesn't make sense. But to implement Timothy into the canonical letters in several places, and to have Acts to make Timothy a core guy of the organization, here you are. I think abbreviation makes historically, semantically, and reductionally little sense. It all speaks for Marcion priority.
Thank you, Doc. Thank you for a great question, and thank you for your answer. Bakken is back again. Thank you for the super chat. Do you think it's possible the church lied about Marcion being a heretic and they accepted his canon full-heartedly, saying a heretic to place continuity above Origen, covering up the switch to Paul?
First of all, I think I would almost entirely subscribe to your statement here. The only thing where today I think we might be a bit more too judgmental is whether the church lied about Marcion being a heretic. I think it is a result of Tertullian as a rhetorician, of Justin being a rhetorician who writes to the emperor, at least he claims to have written to the empress, of Irenaeus being a big preacher and a rhetorician. So whether I'd like to say that all rhetoricians are liars, look, today the big rhetoricians are the American president and his team. So you make your judgment, right? I mean, the marketing is always bordering on lying. Yeah, whether you claim that my dentist paste is removing all the plaques, I don't know. Sometimes maybe it does, but most of the times it doesn't. So I think this is rhetorical talk rather than lies. But I would agree with you that this kind of rhetoric over time created itself a narrative and a story, which if today we know better, then it comes to the question of responsibility, whether we can carry on with this kind of narrative that we were brought up with. And I tell you, that's the reason why I write my books, because I do believe there is a responsibility to tell better than what we learned.
Yeah, thank you so much, Bakken. Appreciate the super chat. Doc Ploromo is back again. Thank you again, Doc. How stable is your reconstruction of Marcion's text when it survives only through hostile polemical sources with their own theological agendas?
You give the answer in a way, because if we only had followers of Marcion, I would not trust their witnesses. I rather trust the witnesses of those people who have their own theological agendas, which are so clear and which we can delineate. Like, for example, if we have a text where Tertullian gives us no indication when, for example, the canonical text has a big ascetic statement, something which would fit totally into Tertullian's polemics against Marcion. And if he doesn't make use of this kind of a polemical argument, either he was drunk, or he was sleeping, or he didn't read precisely, which is usually not the case. He is a very attentive reader. He makes use, if I'm not mistaken, of almost everything he can get hold of, which plays into his arguments. Because he is so hostile, and because he has such a theological agenda against Marcion, it's so easy to detect and to dissect what is Tertullian's and what is not Tertullian's, where he's struggling with. This is a beauty, for example, in 1 Corinthians 14, the question whether women are allowed to speak in the church community, and where he gives us such a vitriol against Marcion, and which explains that in Marcion's Paul, this statement was of the opposite direction than it was, and it is, in the canonical way. In Marcion's text, this was used as one example to discredit the law. So in Marcion's community, women spoke in public, and they were not forbidden to speak. And this is a huge... why on earth, if it was a theological agenda of Tertullian, but he's so against Tekla, baptizing, that he complains that Marcion does not make use of this text in his sense, but in the opposite sense, tells us that he's not lying. He's not making up good arguments for his opponent, right? No, he's struggling with the great arguments of his opponent, and that's quite often the case when you read Tertullian's commentary.
Yeah, there's so many things there. Thank you so much, Doc. Solera Knight, thank you for the super chat. Aesop's Fables, better moral code than the Bible?
Well, I think the New Testament borrows a lot from Aesop's Fables. In addition, I think Aesop's Fables fed in and also were nourished by thoughts that are being picked up by Stoics, which then feed back into the New Testament. I think the Aesop's Fables, and Mark Bilby is a specialist on those mythologicals and fable connections between the Gospels and Greek literature. There's always been this connection. By the way, I was visiting the Jewish synagogue in Erfurt. That was pillowed in a big row in 1349, where the entire Jewish community in this large city of Erfurt was killed. But from the years before, it was the richest community, one of the richest Jewish communities in Germany. And their synagogue still survived, fortunately. And you can visit it. It's a fantastic 2-story building, and it hosted the largest library that we know of big Bibles. But one book from that library that attracted my attention was in Hebrew letters written text by Aesop's Fables. So you can see Aesop's Fables made it not only into the Bible, they also made it in medieval Jewish synagogues and into the libraries. We are not talking about different worlds, yeah? It's one world where we read cross.
Thank you so much. Doc Pluralmanat, again, thank you so much. Last one, sorry. What's your methodological control for scribal habits? Don't we more often see omission and simplification than wholesale expansion? Well, yes, that's true for scribal habits, but that means these are copyists. We're not talking about reductions. So we need to distinguish between scribal habits and reductors. With regards to scribals and scribes, I think I fully agree with you. So you have omissions, you have homoioteleoita, so you jump a line. That's the norm. But in the comparison that we have between the canonical text and the Marcionite text, we come also across these elements where we have simplifications and where we have omissions, where we can detect that, and I've indicated that in the edition. But the phenomenon here between the two versions is a reductional one, right? So 4 letters were not just omitted by a scribe or were lost by external whatever, fire or theft. No, we are talking about a reductional profile. But I think your observation is very, very important, because we have to make those distinctions between what scribes' habits usually are. And let me also say, there are also habits for people who comment on texts, right? So when we use Epiphanius, or when we use Tertullian, or when we use Irenaeus, or anybody else, and you will see that in my reconstruction. For example, when whichever verse we are talking about, I always give all parallel cases where, for example, Tertullian
quotes the same New Testament verse to make sure we see a difference, whether he quotes it from Marcion's version or whether he quotes it in others of his works in the same form or in different forms. And you will see quite quickly what is Tertullian's habit of quoting this verse and how different he quotes the verse when he quotes from Marcion's text, as he sometimes says.
It's this is stuff you have to really dive in the weeds on. Thank you so much, Doc. And then Doc broke his sorry that he gave in his prior super chat, last one, and he gives another one. We love you, Doc. Thank you so much. No sorry needed here. If Luke is 2nd century, how do you avoid a source pileup? Mark, Marcion, and Luke all interacting in a tight window. Isn't that a textual traffic jam?
I love your description. I think I borrow that from you in the future. I only need to remember your name, right? Well, you can talk about a textual traffic jam. I would rather say it's difficult to dissociate the layers. But fortunately, if I'm not mistaken, we don't have too many layers. So we have not too many forths and backs. We have a few distinguishable ones. We might have a few interspersed ones, which we might not be able to detect. But we have big layers where we really have versions and not just the fluidity of text. So we have people who do something, collect, then people pick up something that is collected. They collect themselves, always with a reductional profile. So that makes life a bit easier for us to reconstruct it. But I agree. It's the closer it gets, the more difficult to distinguish it is also correct. So I'm not saying that what I've produced together with the team is a final product. When the English version comes out, we will have slight amendments, and that's the beauty. On the other side, looking back onto almost 150 years Marcionite scholarship, we are talking about refinements of our reconstructions, not about basic contradictions. People, even if people think of Marcion not being having priority, they still came up with a pretty reliable reconstruction of the Marcionite versions. That they have never given us a full Greek text simply depended on the methodological approach that because Marcion was not given priority, they just gave us the deviations to the canonical text. And people thought, people like you and Derek, they could figure out from comparing their canonical text with those deviations what the text of Marcion was. Of course, that is a bit too complicated today. And so I decided to produce the Greek reconstruction as a letter and not just Swiss cheese with holes. Yeah,
there's a lot. Doc, thank you so much. Great super chat. And of course, remembering the name made me think of what is it? Off the Iliad, Achilles, when he approaches the young man and he's like, that's why nobody will remember your name. It's like, so, but we will remember. Docs, thank you so much. Bakken, thank you for the super chat. Have you noticed there's a harmonizing period in the late 2nd, early 3rd century before the finalizing of the canon? John uses 1 John to sound old.
Oh, I agree with you. And I think that's the typical phenomenon, which I think is a feature of the canonical redaction. You want to use those texts cross writings and you want to sound old. That's precisely what it is.
Thank you. Yeah. I don't know if you read Hugo Mendez's book pertaining to John. He thinks that John and the letters 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John are all part of they're all fabrications. Like they're all obviously like he doesn't take the approach I think that some scholars do, that they go 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John might predate the gospel and the gospel's using those. Like they're all fabrications. So one isn't like necessarily decades earlier or something like that they might all be later forgers that are crafting this material, of course. So I need to go back and brush up on the book, but I don't know if you've heard of that or if you've read that or not.
Yeah, I've heard of it. And I think there are good reasons for it, because I do think that these writings come from the edges of a school like Polycarp School. Because when Irenaeus complains about Florinus, one of his fellow students, he accuses him of deviating from Polycarp's school class teaching. And Florinus clearly is a kind of Valentinian scholar. And when Irenaeus produces his books, which is quite interesting, he doesn't give us the name to whom he sends his books. But in the prefaces of books 3 and 4, he characterizes his patron who pays for the books that he writes. And he says, well, I may have given you more than you really paid for. and why have I given you that? So that if you follow those texts that I've given you, you are no longer leading your community into the abyss of the sea. Now, the abyss of the sea is a characterization of the Catholics, particularly of Irenaeus, of the Valentinians. And that shows to me that Irenaeus is so close to the Valentinians and so hostile to the Valentinians because his own patron has paid for writing these books somehow to support his Valentinian Christianity. And Irenaeus is trying to deviate his patron from this type of teaching, and that's why he engages with Valentinian writings. So again, that explains we're talking about a very close relation between so-called heretics and so-called Orthodox people. They're not yet separated in boxes, not in the 2nd century. And those writings, I think, if we say they are coming from this edged, then they're more in that camp, but they're still with half a foot at least in the other camp.
Thank you so much. And then we got a final one here. Mac D, thank you so much for the super chat. Really appreciate it over on the vertical side. Really appreciate that. Listen, I want to just publicly ask everyone in the chat, because I could go on, and I think we've hit our 2-hour mark, and I really don't want to do that. First of all, it's getting late over there, and where Marcus is at. But also, we have to save some more to get into this Acts material and other material, like internal stuff. So I'm asking everyone in the chat, press 1 if you enjoyed this. Right now, I want to see some ones in the chat. And you want to see Dr. Vinzent come back onto MythVision in the near future to do another presentation, to talk more about this stuff in depth. I'm certain we'll get some ones. And if you're watching this later and it's not live and you can't think of something to comment 1. I want to see those ones just so that we know. I'm going to give people a few minutes to do that while we chit chat here for a second. Dr. Vinzent, what are your encouragements to people who are wanting to better investigate understanding Luke, Acts? What you're discussing today is pretty difficult, I think, for a lot of people to just wrap their heads around who haven't studied this in depth. Is there any chance you have some sources specifically that go in the vein of this exact topic we discussed today in greater depth?
Yeah, I think if you've got a library close to where you live, I think it's worth picking up Matthias Klinghart's reconstruction of the Marcionite Gospel, because he has a full volume introduction where he discusses at length the relation between Marcion's Gospel and Luke, and also between Luke and Marcion's Gospel and Acts. So I think that's the best call I can recommend. But then you also can pick up simply Mark Bilby's work on the Gospel of Marcion, and he has also published the Apostolos, the English translation that we have done. So, and those are very cheap books on Amazon. I think there are plenty of stuff. But then, if you can get hold of Pervo's book, I think that's still a good read. Bear in mind that Pervo had no access to Marcion's reconstruction that we have today. But right. I think there's a lot of good stuff out there. There's also good stuff free of charge on the web. Then, as Derek knows, we run not as regular as Derek, but we run a few sessions on Patristica, which you can join. That's all for free. please, link up with us.
Let me pull that up here real quick. We got a couple more super chats that came in here at the last second. But we want to make sure we promote the YouTube channel. I just put in the chat for everybody watching. There is Patristica YouTube channel. It's pretty simple to find. Patristica. If you look that up in YouTube, you can't miss the YouTube channel. There's a lot of people with the ones in the chat. I see everybody there. Yep, they want you back, Marcus. They want you back, brother. Big one from me, one, and many others. So really, really do appreciate that. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, thank you so much for that response. Yeah.
Absolutely. Super chat from Mindfulness 3273. Thank you so much. Professor Vinzent, you are one of the greatest scholars of our time. What is your view on the relation of phenomenology and opening to beginning of research? I missed an earlier one. Oh, no, it's the same one. They sent it twice.
Okay.
Mindfulness, I'm sorry. I don't know why. I don't know why it did that. Sorry, I interrupted you. I apologize.
No. Thank you so much for this contribution. I think phenomenology is utterly important. Husserl was one of the great scholars. He suffered, of course, from his dismissal at the end from his own student, from Heidegger, who removed him from his chair in Freiburg. A sad story. But his views, his idea that we have to focus on the phenomena and how we process these phenomena, of course, is utterly important. That's why when you pick up this latest book on the challenge of early Christianity and the challenge of writing history, you will see there is a whole chapter on cognitive historiography, but there's also, in the beginning, I'm dealing at least tangentially with phenomenology. I'm dealing a bit with the Heideggerian version of writing history. So I think before we start doing something, we have to think about why we do it and how we do it. And this brings us into a methodological question, which I find probably more important even than just looking at evidence.
Mindfulness, thank you so much for the super chat. Lots more ones here. Just getting those ones out, and then we'll get to our last super chat here. Thank you so much. Yeah, Christina, we'll be doing call-in shows at some point. I'm a busy guy. I'm trying the best I know how. But yeah, thank you so much for those ones and everything. Okay. Here we go. This is the last one. Mr. Anderson asks, and thank you, Mr. Anderson, for the super chat. In your best guess, which part of the Bible is the latest written and when? Great stuff today. Thank you.
I think, if I'm not mistaken, that the letter to the Hebrews is one of the last things that were written, because while we have the 13 letter collection of Paul in our manuscripts, in our papyri, the edition of Hebrews is pretty contested for a long time. But I will not forget the Shepherd of Hermas and 1 Clement. So particularly those writings which you have, this Jerusalem Codex from the 12th century, which were part of at least of some codices and some New Testament versions that were around, just like the Apocalypse of Peter, that these texts then finally didn't make it into the canon is a big question. And don't forget, the canon was never, or for a very long time, not ruled upon. The first rule, what is in and what is out, is the Council of Trent, which is 16th century. So that explains why we have these edges that are not quite clear. So the question is also pretty difficult, what is being written last. I think I can, with some confidence, say that the 7 letters that Marcion received and also redacted were one of the earliest texts, I presume, were written. Maybe also the sources of his gospel were written early. And when I say early, it is prior to 140. How prior and how much earlier, that I leave to Derek, because he is more a visionary on that than I am.
Oh goodness, no. Don't paint me with that. I don't know. You know, I do like to listen to different scholars give their best arguments for why they think what they think. And I do like a buffet. I mean, MythVision, you saw a buffet of extinct and living religions in the opening. I also like to give a buffet of scholarship within a field. I like to give a buffet of Hebrew Bible.
So what's your guess? How long is Islam, is Judaism, is Christianity still going ahead?
How long do I predict it?
Yeah, I mean, when are they dying out? Guess.
I honestly don't know. I don't really know, because there's so much cultural engagement back and forth, and I can't imagine. I mean, we're living in a time where you would think some of the advancements we've done would falsify some of the things we once believed. And for many people, it has. But there's such an emotional place in our psychology for why we hold on to things, or why we might continue to grasp onto things like these religions. It's like, I don't know what it's going to take. I imagine, like, a lot of these older religions, for example, they get extinguished. They become extinct through other issues, a outside war, or something happens that ends up causing them to convert. Islam comes in, let's say, and forces people to convert, or Christianity comes in and forces people to convert. It's usually other religions that end up causing a lot of these changes that occur in these areas, or reforms within that prior religion that make it into a new religion, typically due to some specific individual, likely a man who's a prophet, who has a new revisionist kind of revelation. And we've had that happen over and over with Christianity. You get it with the Mormons. You get it with various forms of Christians. The burned out district in New York caused the Seventh-day Adventists and the various other forms. So I don't know. I could even guess to know that, but I would imagine that it wouldn't be forever, because, like you said, there's expiration dates, and I want to hear your thoughts on this. But I keep thinking, we keep imagining Christianity, and we think, look how long it's been around, and it's like, look how long the Mesopotamian tradition or the Egyptian tradition lasted, longer than the Christian one, before they went, and started to fizzle out into the Common Era. And you go back 3, 4, 5. I mean, there's a really ancient pedigree to a lot of these traditions. Of course, they evolve and change, but they still had continuity. And Christianity, I would say, they want to latch on to Judaism, but it's like Christianity as we know it is only 2,000 years. And anyway, what are your thoughts? I'm curious.
Well, I fully agree with you, but you sounded a bit like the Greeks thinkers of the 3rd and 4th century AD. I think they would have said exactly the same as you. I mean, we have been around for hundreds, if not thousands of years. Everybody believes in what we believe. I mean, we have temples in every city. We have, in the smallest village, we have our gods on all the fields. I mean, who would doubt that this is surviving thousands of years? The experience is, of course, that those who believe that political reigns or religious areas lived for thousands of years are usually caught up by history. But I think we postpone the answer to that question to a future session.
Yeah, I'd like to get your thoughts on that. You got me thinking. I mean, I imagine something would need to give for it to end, though. I don't think it's just on its own, typically. I think there's going to be factors, pressures, whatever it might be, that causes people to finally go, enough is enough. There's so many books, too, that, like, this book book right here. I don't know. Have you ever read this book, Francesca Stavrakopoulos' book, God and Anatomy?
No.
It's a fantastic book, right?
Okay.
It's literally on the topic of God's anatomy. And
Wow.
she points out how the Hebrew God of the Old Testament, which is, El Yahweh, which they get merged and whatnot, and she goes through the scholarship. But he has a body. She goes into all about the body, including the penis, which I find really interesting. She covers that because there's other books like Esther Hamori and other Hebrew Bible scholars who've written on God's body, but they don't really touch on the sexuality of God, and that God is a male with a wife named Asherah or Therat, if you go back to ancient Canaan. And so she covers all of this, right? God's body in all its glory. The final chapter it gets me every time. She wrote it really, really well. The final chapter is an autopsy.
Wow.
Okay, she titled it An Autopsy of God. Yeah. And she starts it like this. The Bible is bunkum. It's God is dead. Kind of sounds Nietzsche,
Yeah.
At least that's what myriad thinkers and writers have told us. Since the Enlightenment, prominent Western intellectuals have not only rendered the biblical God lifeless, but reduced him to a mere phantom conjured by human imagination. And yet the God of the Bible looks nothing like the deity dissected and dismissed by modern atheism. So what ultimately, and she describes God's body, the way I walk away from this chapter is Christians, through philosophical means, through the Platonic world, that means Stoicism, Middle Platonism, Neoplatonism, all these things, they have bastardized the text of their scripture to a point where they themselves, just like the Greeks did to their prior gods through their philosophical models, Zeus didn't sleep with her. No, that's an allegory. That's a metaphor. That can't be, because gods don't have passions. What they've done is they've made God into this ethereal, abstract, outside space and time thing. They don't realize it. They've killed God. Now, they made God into something God was never in the prior revelation, in the prior scriptures. And once you have this abstract deity that is so foreign from the actual text you read, it's like it's a small step to go, what are you holding on to anymore?
Yeah.
You see what I mean? So I don't know I don't know the answer to your question, what you're going to say. I'll be curious to hear what you have to say, but I just love learning about all this stuff from a human standpoint,
Yeah, no, it's fantastic. Did you interview her?
Yes, several times.
Oh, right. Okay.
Yeah, and if you're interested in hearing it, we get into some of the scandalous portions because she has interpretations other Hebrew Bible scholars don't want to take, but she thinks there's some Hebrew euphemisms that indicate it's discussing God's penis. Isaiah 6 talks about God, he's sitting in his throne room. The prophet sees him, I think it's Isaiah 6, and that his train fills up the whole temple. But the term that is in Hebrew there, she wants to highlight as a euphemism for God's, he has a massive penis. Yeah. And I find that like, what? Like, we never would ever know this had she not, or other scholars not pointed out, God has a tangible body in the minds of its ancient worshipers. And she shows all sorts of examples in the ancient Near East of temples with footprints, like in Syria, where the gods entering into the temple. They imagine a god with an actual body like us. So anyway,
very interesting. No, I haven't seen the book, but I will look at it. Wonderful.
Yes. Final words from you, Dr. Vinzent.
Well, thank you so much for listening and for staying with us for so long. I hope you enjoyed it, and you can see it's these are questions of big concern and great responsibilities which lie on us. And I think we're carrying on with the work, and there is no final word set in stones. Observations, and continue writing, and hopefully engaging with you. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Check out his books on Amazon, ladies and gentlemen. Markus Vinzent. That's Marcus with a K and Vincent with a Z. I hope you go check that out.
With a Z.
A Z. Check him out there. Also, go to the Patristica YouTube channel and subscribe. I hope more and more people will engage what you're doing. I'm thankful that you're willing to come on a platform like mine to popularize these ideas, and it's not just staying in what I call the ivory tower of scholarship. You have your own discussions and debates, but the rest of us here, mere mortals on planet Earth, don't get to see and engage it, but you're willing to come out here, and I really appreciate it.
Thank you so much. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Till next time, never forget, we are MythVision.
Son, do you want to know what the truth is? After this, there's no turning back. You take the blue pill and you wake up in your bed and believe whatever you want to. You take the red pill and you stay in Wonderland, and I show you just how deep the rabbit hole goes. Remember, all I'm offering is the truth, nothing more.